On a rain-swept October night, James Cooper discovers an unexpected guest in his barn. With foreclosure looming and his harvest failing, the last thing this hard-working farmer needs is another challenge. But when he finds a rain-drenched woman seeking shelter, his instinct to help outweighs his troubles. What he doesn't know is that she's Elizabeth Morgan, a billionaire heiress who fled her gilded cage in search of something genuine. As she experiences his simple yet profound way of life, and he shows her kindness without agenda, an unexpected connection forms. But when her true identity emerges, both must confront whether authentic love can bridge their vastly different worlds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm rattled the barn's weathered boards as James Cooper held his lantern higher, its light catching on something out of place among the hay bales. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It wouldn't be the first time. Exhaustion had gotten the better of him after 18-hour days, trying to salvage what he could of the failing wheat crop. But then she moved, and his breath caught in his throat. She was huddled in the corner, dripping wet and shivering, her clothes clearly expensive but now muddied and torn. Their eyes met, and James saw equal measures of wariness and desperation. In her gaze, he'd seen that look before, in wounded animals that had sought shelter in his barn over the years, the kind that could bolt or bite, depending on how you approached them. "Evening," he said softly, keeping his voice level and staying where he was. "Nasty night to be caught out in the storm." He lowered the lantern slightly, trying to appear less threatening. The woman, he guessed she was in her early 40s, though it was hard to tell in this light, pulled herself up straighter, but didn't speak. Her hands were trembling, though whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. James glanced back toward the farmhouse, its windows glowing warm against the darkness. The bank's final notice sat unopened on his kitchen table. He hadn't had the heart to read it yet, though he knew what it would say. 30 years of Cooper family history about to slip through his fingers like sand. He had enough troubles, without inviting more in. But his mother's voice echoed in his memory. The measure of a person isn't in what they have, but in what they give, when they have nothing left to give. He cleared his throat. "I've got coffee on, and some soup staying. Warm on the stove. Nothing fancy, but it's hot. You're welcome to both." He paused, then added, "No questions asked." Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. She stood slowly, and he noticed she moved with a natural grace despite her bedraggled state. "I thank you," she said, her voice cultured but uncertain. "I don't want to impose." James couldn't help but smile slightly at that. "Ma'am, on a night like this, hospitality isn't an imposition, it's just basic human decency." He gestured toward the house. "I'm James Cooper, and you're not imposing." As they walked toward the house, the wind howling around them, James noticed how she took in everything. The peeling paint on the porch, the worn steps, the ancient wind chimes his wife Sarah had loved so much, still singing their broken song after all these years. He saw no judgment in her observation, only a kind of wonder, as if she were memorizing every detail. Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled of vegetable soup. His mother's recipe, one of the few things he could cook well. Family photos lined the walls, 4 generations of Coopers working this same land. His great-grandfather's stern face alongside his father's warm smile. His mother in her garden. Sarah laughing on their wedding day before the cancer took her far too young. The woman's eyes lingered on the photos as James poured coffee into his mother's old china cups, the fancy ones he almost never used anymore. Her gaze stopped. On the newest edition, yesterday's newspaper clipping about local farms facing foreclosure, the Cooper farm was mentioned by name. "I'm Elizabeth," she said finally, accepting the coffee with hands that had stopped shaking. "And thank you for the kindness." James nodded, noting how she didn't offer a last name. That was fine. Everyone had their reasons for keeping secrets. He had enough of his own. Instead, he ladled soup into bowls, set out bread that was only slightly stale, and pulled out a chair for her at the kitchen table. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the storm's fury and the occasional creak of the old house. James noticed how she held the spoon, delicately, with an unconscious refinement that spoke of a very different life than this one. But she ate every bite of the simple meal as if it were the finest cuisine she'd ever tasted. When she finished, Elizabeth looked up at him with eyes that held a depth of gratitude that made him uncomfortable. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why help a stranger when—" Her gaze flickered to the newspaper clipping. James considered the question as he cleared the bowls. "Because kindness doesn't check your bank balance first," he said finally, "and because everyone needs shelter from the storm sometimes." The grandfather clock in the hall, another family heirloom, chimed 10. "There's a spare room upstairs," James said. "It's small, and the quilt's a bit faded, but it's dry and warm. You're welcome to it, for tonight at least." Elizabeth's eyes welled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Yes, thank you." As James showed her to the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this storm had blown something unexpected into his life, something that might change everything, for better or worse. But that was tomorrow's worry. For tonight, he'd done what his parents had taught him, offered kindness without expectation of return. He never could have guessed how that simple act of decency would reshape his entire world. Elizabeth woke to unfamiliar sounds, a rooster's crow, the distant lowing of cattle, and the creak of old wooden floors. For a moment, she lay still in the narrow bed, its handmade quilt wrapped around her, trying to remember the last time she'd slept so deeply. Probably not since before she'd taken over as CEO of Morgan Industries after her father's death. The events of the previous night came flooding back, the desperate drive away from yet another board meeting where her father's old friends had tried to pressure her into selling the company, the storm, the kind farmer with gentle eyes who'd offered shelter without demanding explanations. She reached instinctively for her phone, then remembered she'd turned it off last night, unwilling to let the real world intrude just yet. The sound of movement downstairs drew her attention. Pots clanking, the screen door squeaking open and shut. Elizabeth found her clothes from yesterday, now dried, but still showing the evidence of her undignified arrival. She smoothed them as best she could and made her way downstairs. James Cooper stood at an ancient stove, his movements sure and practiced as he cracked eggs into a cast-iron skillet. He turned at her footsteps, and she saw the moment of surprise cross his face. Perhaps he'd half expected her to have vanished in the night. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "Hope you like farm breakfast. It's not fancy, but it'll keep you going." "It smells wonderful," Elizabeth replied honestly. The kitchen looked different in the morning light, worn but immaculately clean, with copper pots hanging from a rack and an old cookbook propped open on the counter. She moved closer to look at it, drawn by the handwritten notes in the margins. "My mother's," James explained, turning back to the stove. She wrote down all her adaptations. "Recipe says butter, but lard works fine in hard times. That sort of thing." He smiled slightly. "She was big on making do with what you had." Elizabeth's throat tightened unexpectedly. Her own mother had died when she was young, leaving behind nothing so personal as handwritten notes, just a trust fund and a society position Elizabeth had never felt comfortable filling. "May I help?" she asked, wanting to earn her keep somehow. James hesitated only briefly before nodding toward a loaf of bread. "Toast? The toaster's temperamental. You have to press the lever down twice." They worked together in surprisingly comfortable silence, James tending to eggs and bacon, while Elizabeth wrestled with the ancient toaster. When it finally produced perfectly browned toast, she felt an absurd sense of accomplishment. Over breakfast, James explained the farm's daily rhythm. "Usually I'd be out earlier, but the rain means no field work until things dry a bit. Still plenty to do, though. Animals need feeding, rain or shine. Could I—" Elizabeth paused, then pressed on. "Could I help? I know I'm not dressed for it, but I'd like to learn." James studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Reckon. We can find you some work clothes. Sarah, my late wife, left some things. Might not be what you're used to, but they'll hold up better than what you've got on." The mention of his wife sent a pang through Elizabeth's heart, both for his loss and for the simple evidence of love in his voice. She changed quickly into the offered clothes, sturdy jeans and a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of lavender. When she came back downstairs, James was waiting by the door with rubber boots. "First lesson," he said with a hint of amusement, "is keeping your feet dry." The morning passed in a blur of new experiences. James showed her how to feed the chickens. Don't let them bully you, they can sense fear. Check the cattle, watch the red one, she's got attitude. And clean stalls, not glamorous but necessary. To her surprise, Elizabeth found herself enjoying the straightforward nature of the work. Every task had a clear purpose, a visible result. Around mid-morning, they paused for coffee on the porch. Elizabeth watched a pair of cardinals flit between the trees, their bright feathers stark against the grey sky. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for this, for not asking questions." James was quiet for a moment. "Everyone's got their stories," he said finally, "and their reasons for keeping them close." He took a sip of coffee. "The way I see it, sometimes what a person needs most is just a chance to breathe, figure things out in their own time." Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. When was the last time someone had given her that gift? The simple freedom to just be without expectations or demands. In her world, everything came with strings attached, appearances to maintain, roles to fill. "The farm's not much," James continued, his voice soft. "But for whatever you're running from, or toward, you're welcome to stay, at least until you figure out your next step." The offer hung in the morning air between them, weighted with possibility. Elizabeth looked at him, this man who had every reason to be bitter about his circumstances, but instead chose kindness, who wore his own grief with quiet dignity, who saw her confusion and offered not judgment, but understanding. "I'd like that," she said finally, "to stay, for a little while." Neither of them could have known then how that simple acceptance would change both their lives forever. Later that afternoon, while James was repairing a fence in the north field, Elizabeth slipped into the barn and pulled her phone from its hiding place in her bag. 47 missed calls, 93 text messages. Her finger hovered over the power button, tempted to turn it off again, but responsibility won out. She had to at least let them know she was safe. A single text to her assistant. "I'm fine, need time, handle things." She turned the phone off before the reply could come through, but not before seeing the headlines. "Morgan heiress missing. Elizabeth Morgan's mysterious disappearance. Morgan Industries stock drops amid CEO's absence." The weight of her other life settled heavily on her shoulders. Out there she was Elizabeth Morgan, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, trustee of the Morgan Foundation, darling of the society pages. Here she was just Elizabeth, learning to feed chickens and muck stalls, wearing borrowed clothes and eating simple meals that somehow tasted better than any five-star restaurant. "You okay?" James's voice startled her. He stood in the barn doorway, tools in hand, concern etching his weathered features. Elizabeth quickly tucked the phone away. "Yes, just checking something." He nodded, not pressing, though she saw the questions in his eyes. Instead, he said, "Thought you might want to learn about the irrigation system. Not exciting, but it's the farm's lifeblood." She followed him to the field, grateful for his tact. As he explained the complex network of pipes and pumps, Elizabeth found herself drawing parallels to business systems. Flow, efficiency, pressure points. When she suggested a modification that might save water, James looked at her with new respect. "You've got a good head for systems," he said. "Where'd you learn that?" Elizabeth froze momentarily, but recovered. "Oh, I've done some business consulting." Not technically a lie, but the omission felt heavy. They worked together through the afternoon, James teaching her the farm's rhythms while sharing bits of its history. The land had been in his family. For 4 generations, since his great-grandfather had claimed it with nothing but determination and a handful of seeds. He kept a journal, James said, pointing to the farmhouse. Still have it somewhere. Wrote about every crop, every season, every hardship and triumph. His voice grew quieter. Sometimes on tough days I read it. Reminds me that struggle is part of the story, not the end of it. Elizabeth watched him as he spoke, seeing the pride and worry warring in his expression. The bank notice she'd spotted. Yesterday weighed on her mind. With one phone call, she could solve his financial troubles. One signature could save this legacy he cherished. But she'd seen it too many times, how money changed things, transformed relationships, shifted them. Balance of power. The genuine connection growing between them felt precious precisely because it was uncomplicated by wealth and status. That evening she helped him prepare dinner, chopping vegetables while he told stories about learning to cook from his mother. She insisted all her children know their way around a kitchen, said self-reliance was the greatest gift she could give us. She sounds wonderful, Elizabeth said softly, thinking of her own mother who had died before teaching her anything about life beyond social graces and investment portfolios. She was. James smiled at a memory. Would have liked you, I think. She always said you could tell a person's character by how they handled honest work. The simple compliment warmed her more than any society-page flattery ever had. Here, her worth was measured in willingness to learn, to help, to engage with real things. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the evening chorus of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Sometimes, James said quietly, I wonder if I'm the one who'll lose it all. 4 generations of Coopers kept this land going through dust bowls, depressions, droughts. And now, he trailed off, the weight of potential failure heavy in his voice. Elizabeth's chest tightened. She understood burden of legacy all too well, though from a vastly different perspective. What would help? She asked carefully. Besides the obvious financial miracle, he considered the question seriously. Modernization, probably. Better. Equipment, updated irrigation, maybe diversifying crops. He shook his head. But that takes capital I don't have. Banks aren't exactly eager to lend to struggling farmers these days. Elizabeth's mind raced with solutions, investment opportunities, agricultural grants, modernization strategies she'd studied for her company's agricultural division. But offering that expertise would lead to questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she said, I believe in you, James. That probably doesn't mean much from a stranger, but I've seen how you work, how you think. You're not going to let this place go without a fight. He turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her heart skip. You're not a stranger, he said softly. Not anymore. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Elizabeth felt the familiar urge to run, from complications, from potential hurt, from the deception that grew heavier by the day. But something stronger held her there. The sense that she'd stumbled upon something real, something precious. In its simplicity, as the last light faded from the sky, she made a silent promise to find a way to help him that wouldn't destroy what was growing between them. She just had to figure out how to bridge her 2 worlds without letting either one collapse. On her 5th morning at the farm, Elizabeth found herself alone in the chicken coop, facing down a particularly aggressive Rhode Island red. I am the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, she muttered, clutching the feed bucket. I will not be intimidated by poultry. The chicken eyed her dubiously, clearly unimpressed by corporate credentials. Having a standoff, James's amused voice came from behind her. She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, trying to hide a smile. We're negotiating terms, Elizabeth replied, with as much dignity as she could muster. Her hair was coming loose from its ponytail, and her borrowed boots were caked with mud, but she'd never felt more herself. James stepped in and demonstrated again how to scatter the feed with confidence. "They can smell fear," he said, echoing his earlier lesson. "Kinda like board members." Elizabeth laughed, then caught herself. She hadn't mentioned anything about board meetings, but James was focused on the chickens, apparently not noticing his inadvertent hit close to home. Over the past few days, she'd made progress in other areas of farm work. She could now operate the ancient tractor, though James still winced at her turns, identify different types of feed, and help with basic equipment maintenance. Each small victory felt more satisfying than any corporate merger. "Think you're ready to learn about the irrigation pipes?" James asked as they left the coop. "The north field needs checking." Before Elizabeth could answer, a truck pulled up the driveway. She instinctively stepped behind James, her heart racing, but it was only Martha Wilson, the owner of the general store in town. "James Cooper," Martha called out, climbing down from her truck. "Don't tell me you've been hiding this lovely helper of yours for days without introducing her to the community." Elizabeth felt James tense slightly beside her. They hadn't discussed how to explain her presence to others. "Martha," he said carefully, "this is Elizabeth. She's—" he hesitated. "A friend," Elizabeth supplied, stepping forward with the polished smile she'd perfected at countless charity galas. "James has been kind enough to teach me about farming." Martha's eyes sparkled with interest. "Well, isn't that something? You know, we don't get many newcomers out here, especially not ones willing to get their hands dirty." She looked Elizabeth over, taking in the work clothes and mud-spattered boots with approval. "Elizabeth's a natural," James said, and the pride in his voice made her cheeks warm. Martha pulled a copy of the local newspaper from her truck. "Thought you might want to see this, James. They're doing a feature on local farms facing foreclosure. Might be some resources listed that could help." Elizabeth moved closer, scanning the article. Her breath caught. There, in a smaller article, below, was a grainy photo of her at her last public appearance. "Morgan Harris still missing," the headline read. She glanced quickly at James and Martha, but neither seemed to be looking at that section. "Actually," Martha continued, "there's a community meeting tonight at the Grange Hall. Farmers helping farmers, you know. You should both come." She gave Elizabeth a warm smile. "Always good to have fresh perspectives." After Martha left, James turned to Elizabeth. "You don't have to come tonight. Small-town meetings can be intense." "I'd like to," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "If you want me there." He studied her face for a moment. "I do," he said simply. They spent the afternoon working on the irrigation system, Elizabeth paying careful attention to every detail. If she was going to attend this meeting, she wanted to understand the real issues these farmers faced. As the sun began to set, they cleaned up for the meeting. Elizabeth found herself studying her reflection in the bathroom mirror. 5 days of physical labor had left her hands calloused and her skin sun-kissed. Designer suits and boardroom presentations felt like a lifetime ago. The Grange Hall was packed when they arrived. Elizabeth recognized faces she'd seen in James's family photos, the children and grandchildren of people who'd worked this land for generations. They greeted James warmly, curiosity about his companion evident in their eyes. The meeting began, and Elizabeth listened intently as farmers discussed their struggles. Outdated equipment, rising costs, changing weather patterns, bank pressures. Her mind raced with potential solutions, but she bit her tongue. Elizabeth Morgan might know about agricultural investment strategies and sustainable farming initiatives, but this Elizabeth needed to listen and learn. During a break, she overheard 2 older women discussing her. "Did you see how she looked at him during his speech?" one whispered. "And the way he keeps checking to make sure she's comfortable? Haven't seen James look at anyone that way since Sarah." Elizabeth's heart fluttered. She hadn't noticed James watching her. She'd been too busy watching him, admiring how he commanded respect from his peers without any of the power play she was used to in corporate meetings. On the drive home, James was quiet. Finally, he said, "Thank you for coming. It means a lot having someone understand what we're fighting for." Elizabeth looked out at the darkened fields, the stars brilliant above them. She did understand, more than he knew. She understood the weight of legacy, the responsibility to protect something bigger than yourself. And she was beginning to understand that sometimes the simplest things, like a farmer's calloused hand holding hers in a community meeting, could be worth more than all the wealth in the world. But as they pulled up to the farmhouse, her phone buzzed in her pocket with another message from her assistant. "Board meeting called. Must address CEO absence. Please respond." The two worlds she was trying to straddle were about to collide. She just hoped she could find a way to keep her footing when they did. That night, after the community meeting, neither of them felt like sleeping. They ended up in the kitchen, where James pulled out a dusty bottle of whiskey from a high cabinet. "Sarah's father gave us this on our wedding day," he said, studying. "The label said to save it for a special occasion. Never felt right opening it after. Well," he set 2 glasses on the table. "But tonight I think we could both use a talk." Elizabeth watched as he poured, noticing how his hands trembled slightly. There was something intimate about this moment. Sharing a drink meant for another life, another future that never came to be. "Tell me about her," Elizabeth asked softly. "Sarah?" James swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes distant. "She grew up on the farm next door. Used to catch her stealing apples from our orchard when we were kids." A smile touched his lips. "She'd always bring me half, said that made it a fair trade." He took a small sip before continuing. "She loved this place as much as I did. Had all these plans for it. Wanted to start a pick-your-own berry patch, maybe host school groups, show city kids where their food comes from." His voice roughened. "She was teaching first grade in town when she got sick. We had 6 years together, married 5. Elizabeth reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. His skin was warm, calloused, real. "She sounds wonderful." She was. James turned his hand over, their fingers intertwining naturally. "The hardest part wasn't losing her, though God knows that nearly broke me. It was losing the future we'd planned. All those dreams we'd never get to build together." The whiskey burned Elizabeth's throat as she took a sip, giving her a moment to steady her voice. "My mother died when I was 12, she offered. "I barely remember her now, just impressions, the smell of her perfume, how she hummed while she worked. But I remember the after, how everything changed." James squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "My father." Elizabeth chose her words carefully, avoiding specifics that might reveal too much. "He was a powerful man, used to running everything, fixing everything, but he couldn't fix this, couldn't bring her back. So he threw himself into work, building something bigger, as if success could fill the empty spaces she left behind." She took another sip of whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "I followed in his footsteps because it seemed like the only way to be close to him. Learned to be what everyone expected. The perfect daughter. The perfect..." She caught herself before saying heir. "The perfect everything." "And now?" James asked quietly. Elizabeth looked around the kitchen at the worn floors and humble furnishings that had begun to feel more like home than her penthouse ever had. "Now I'm learning who I might be without all those expectations." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still linked across the table. Through the window, crickets chirped their evening symphony, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. "I found her garden tools yesterday," James said suddenly, "when I was looking for that spare hose. They were right where she left them, still clean and oiled. She was always better about maintaining equipment than me." He gave a rough laugh. "Should probably move them after all this time, but they're exactly where they belong," Elizabeth finished softly. She understood now why he kept Sarah's clothes, her cookbooks, her wind chimes. They weren't relics of grief, but touchstones of love, proof that Sarah had been real, had lived and laughed and loved in these rooms. "You know what Sarah would say about all this?" James gestured vaguely, encompassing the farm's troubles, his struggles, everything. She'd say, "Jimmy Cooper, you can't control the weather or the markets or the banks. All you can control is how you face each day and who you choose to be when things get hard." Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. She was wise. "Yeah," James smiled, though his eyes were bright. "Think she'd like you too. You've got the same way of seeing through things to what matters." The weight of her deception pressed suddenly heavy on Elizabeth's chest. Here was this man sharing his deepest pain, trusting her with his memories and his heart. And she was lying to him with every omission, every careful edit of her past. But looking at him in the gentle kitchen light, she knew she couldn't bear to see his expression change when he learned who she really was. Couldn't bear to have this pure, honest connection tainted by wealth and status and power. Just a few more days, she told herself, a few more days to be just Elizabeth, to experience this simple, profound connection, to understand what it meant to be valued for who she was, not what she owned. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing her with me." James lifted their joined hands, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned, courtly almost, but utterly sincere. "Thank you for listening, for understanding." They finished their drinks in peaceful silence, each lost in thought, but anchored by their linked hands, as the night deepened around the old farmhouse and its awakening hearts. Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the farmer's market. Elizabeth helped James load the truck with what remained of his late summer harvest: tomatoes that had survived the recent storms, hardy squash, the last of the sweet corn. She'd learned to pack the produce carefully, arranging everything just so to prevent bruising during the drive into town. "You don't have to come," James said, though his tone suggested he hoped she would. "Market days can be long. Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Elizabeth replied, already climbing into the passenger seat. She'd spent the previous evening studying his old sales ledgers, her business mind clicking into gear as she analyzed patterns in pricing and demand. The town square was already bustling when they arrived, other farmers setting up their stalls. In the cool morning air, Elizabeth noticed how they positioned their displays, unconsciously applying years of retail psychology to her observations. As James set up their stand, she heard whispers from nearby vendors. "Cooper's friend," they called her, and she found she liked that identity better than any other she'd worn. "Good morning, James." A well-dressed woman approached their stall, examining the tomatoes. "These look lovely." "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," James replied. "How's the restaurant doing?" Elizabeth's ears perked up. Restaurant? She studied the woman more carefully, noting the way she professionally assessed each item's quality. "Oh, struggling like everyone else," Mrs. Henderson sighed. "With the new highway bypass, we're seeing fewer tourists. Makes it hard to justify buying local when the wholesalers offer such low prices." Elizabeth couldn't help herself. "Have you considered marketing the local connection more prominently?" Both James and Mrs. Henderson turned to look at her. "I mean, farm to table is a huge trend in the restaurant industry. People will pay premium prices for authentic local experiences." Mrs. Henderson looked intrigued. "Go on." "You could feature the farms you source from, tell their stories, maybe even do special events, themed dinners highlighting seasonal produce." Elizabeth warmed to the topic, drawing on her knowledge of successful restaurant chains her company had invested in. It's not just about selling food anymore. It's about selling the experience, the connection to the community. "That's actually brilliant," Mrs. Henderson said slowly. "We could start with a harvest dinner series." She turned to James. "Would you be interested in participating? People would love to hear the Cooper Farm's history." James looked stunned by this turn of events. Yes, that could work." As Mrs. Henderson left with a large order and promises to discuss the dinner series further, James turned to Elizabeth. "Where did you learn so much about restaurant marketing?" Elizabeth's heart skipped. "Oh, just business consulting, remember? You pick things up." Before he could question further, a familiar voice called out, "James Cooper, your friend is a genius." Martha Wilson hurried over from her shop across the square. "I just heard what she suggested to Carol Henderson. That's exactly what this town needs, a way to turn our farming heritage into a destination." Soon their stall was surrounded by local business owners, all excited about the possibilities. Elizabeth found herself sketching out marketing plans on the back of a sales receipt, carefully tempering her suggestions to seem knowledgeable, but not suspiciously so. "We could coordinate," the owner of the bed and breakfast was saying. "Feature local farms in our rooms, offer tours. And my store could showcase local products more prominently," Martha added. "Create gift baskets for tourists." Elizabeth's mind raced with possibilities, seeing how all the pieces could fit together to create a sustainable local economy. But as she looked at James, she caught an odd expression on his face, pride mixed with something like uncertainty. During a lull in customers, she found a notebook in the truck and began writing detailed suggestions for the farm. Ways to diversify income streams, capitalize on the farm's history, optimize production without compromising quality. Her pen flew across the paper, years of business experience flowing out in carefully anonymized form. "What's all this?" James asked, looking over her shoulder. "Just some ideas," Elizabeth said, suddenly self-conscious. "Things that might help. You don't have to use any of them." He picked up the notebook, reading carefully. "These are professional-level business strategies." His voice held a question. "I told you I did consulting," she said weakly. James set the notebook down gently. "Elizabeth," he paused, choosing his words, "I'm grateful for your help, more than you know, but sometimes I feel like there's a lot you're not telling me." The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Before Elizabeth could respond, a commotion near the square's entrance drew their attention. A sleek black car had pulled up, the kind that never stopped in their small town. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, scanning the crowd. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She recognized him, Thomas Walsh, her father's old friend, and the head of her board of directors. "I need to," she gestured vaguely toward the truck. "Bathroom break." She ducked behind the vehicle, heart pounding. Through the window, she saw Walsh moving through the market, showing something on his phone to vendors, her photo, almost certainly. James was busy with customers, not noticing her panic or Walsh's approach. Elizabeth slipped between stalls, keeping her head down until she reached Martha's shop. The older woman took one look at her face and wordlessly ushered her through to the back room. Only when she heard Walsh's car leave sometime later did Elizabeth emerge, shaken but relieved. She'd managed to avoid discovery, but for how much longer? She returned to find James selling the last of their produce, their most successful market day in months. The notebook full of her suggestions sat on the truck's dashboard, a reminder of both her potential to help and the deceptions that kept her from doing so openly. "Everything okay?" James asked as they loaded up. "You disappeared for a while." "Yes," Elizabeth said, hating how easily the lies came now. "Just needed some air. It got a bit overwhelming." He nodded, but she could feel his questions multiplying. The drive home was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The notebook between them felt like both a bridge and a barrier, proof of what she could offer and of all she was holding back. The weather radio crackled with static as James adjusted the dial, his expression growing more worried with each update. "Major system moving in," he announced, setting the radio on the kitchen counter. "Could be worse than last week's storm." Elizabeth looked up from where she was helping him check emergency supplies. "How bad?" "Bad enough." He pulled out an old family Bible from a drawer, its pages stuffed with newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. Cooper Farm weather records go back 4 generations. Pattern looks similar to the storm of '85. That one nearly wiped out 3 farms in the valley. Thunder rumbled in the distance as they worked to secure the farm. Elizabeth found herself watching James as he moved with practiced efficiency, noting how the responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar weight. In just over a week, she'd learned to read his moods, to understand the subtle shifts in his expression that revealed his concerns. "The irrigation pond's already high from last week," he said, studying the darkening sky. "If it overflows, it could flood the lower field." He hesitated, then pulled out his phone. Should call in some help. Within an hour, trucks started arriving, other farmers from the community coming to help their neighbor protect his land. Elizabeth watched, in amazement, as they organized themselves without much discussion, each person knowing their role in this well-practiced dance of crisis management. "Elizabeth," Martha called from her truck, "we're setting up sandbags by the pond. Extra hands needed." For the next few hours, Elizabeth worked alongside the others, passing bags down a human chain as the wind picked up and the first heavy drops began to fall. Her muscles ached, her borrowed clothes were caked with mud, but she felt strangely exhilarated. This was what real wealth looked like. Neighbors showing up for each other without being asked. "You're good at this," said an older man she recognized from the market as he helped her position a particularly heavy bag. Most city folks would have run inside by now. Before Elizabeth could respond, a shout came from the direction of the barn. One of the support beams was showing signs of strain under the increasing wind. James immediately headed that way, calling for rope and extra hands. Elizabeth found herself working alongside him, holding a flashlight as he and two other men secured the beam. Rain plastered his shirt to his back, and she could see the tension in every line of his body. This barn held more than just equipment. It held his family's history, his livelihood, his future. "James!" someone called from outside. "Pond's rising fast." He straightened, conflict clear on his face. Too many problems, too few hands. Without thinking, Elizabeth touched his arm. "Go, I'll monitor the beam, call if anything changes." He met her eyes, and something passed between them. Trust, partnership, understanding. Then he was gone, running toward the new crisis. Elizabeth kept watch, one hand on the beam to feel for movement, the other holding the flashlight steady. Through the barn's open door, she could see figures moving through the rain, working to protect the farm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark bursts. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She'd taken to carrying it again after Walsh's appearance at the market. Keeping one eye on the beam, she glanced at the screen. A news alert. "Morgan Industries Board calls emergency meeting. CEO's extended absence threatens company stability." The beam creaked ominously, pulling her attention back. Elizabeth shoved the phone away, focusing on the immediate crisis. Right now, she wasn't a CEO or an heiress. She was just another pair of hands trying to save a family farm. Hours passed, in the blur of rain and mud and collective effort. Eventually, the worst of the storm passed, leaving behind a grey dawn and exhausted workers. The farm had survived. The pond held, the barn stood, the fields were damaged but not destroyed. James found her as the others were leaving, their trucks pulling out with waves and tired smiles. He looked drained, but grateful. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying, for helping." Elizabeth nodded, too tired for words. They walked together toward the house, shoulders nearly touching. On the porch, James stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "I don't know who you really are," he said quietly, "or why you're running from whatever you're running from, but I know who you've been here these past days, how you work, how you think, how you—" He paused, swallowing hard. "How you fit." Elizabeth felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. Everything she'd done to help the farm, she'd done without her wealth, or connections, or power. Just her hands, her mind, her heart. "I should go clean up," she said softly, unable to meet his eyes, because he was right. She did fit here, in this life of honest work and clear purpose, but the life she'd left behind was reaching for her, with increasing urgency, threatening to shatter this fragile new world she'd found. As she headed upstairs, she saw James pick up the old family Bible, adding notes about tonight's storm to its pages. Another chapter in the Cooper farm's history, and she was part of it now, for better or worse. In her room, she finally looked. At her phone again. Dozens of missed calls, emails, messages, and a new text from Walsh. "Found you. We need to talk." The storm might have passed, but Elizabeth knew her own personal tempest was just beginning. The day after the storm dawned clear and golden, as if nature was apologizing for its fury. Elizabeth woke early, her muscles aching from the previous night's work, to find James already in the kitchen. He stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the wet fields in shades of amber. "Thought I'd find you out assessing the damage," she said, accepting the mug he wordlessly offered her. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, sending a familiar warmth through her that had nothing to do with coffee. "Some things are worth pausing for," he replied, his eyes still on the horizon. "Dad used to say sunrise after a storm was God's way of reminding us to hope." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day emerge. Elizabeth was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the quiet strength he radiated. After their shared battle against the storm, something had shifted between them, as if the rain had washed away another layer of reserve. Later, they walked the property together, cataloguing damage and making plans for repairs. The floodwaters had carved new channels through the lower field, but thanks to their preparations, nothing was beyond recovery. "We could redirect that new water flow," Elizabeth suggested, pointing to where the storm had altered the landscape. "Turn it into an advantage instead of fighting it." She sketched a quick diagram in her notebook, drawing on half-remembered agricultural projects her company had funded. James studied her drawing with interest. "That's actually brilliant. Where did you learn about water management?" Elizabeth hesitated, then offered a partial truth. "My father's company dealt with some agricultural projects. I used to study the reports." He nodded, but she saw that familiar flicker of questions in his eyes. Before he could voice them, she pointed to a fallen tree branch. "We should probably clear that before it causes problems." They worked together through the morning, falling into an easy rhythm. Elizabeth found herself studying him when he wasn't. Looking, the way his hands moved with sure confidence, how the sun brought out auburn highlights in his hair, the quiet grace in his movements. Around midday, they reached the far corner of the property, where an ancient oak tree spread its branches over a small rise. James set down his tools and pulled a surprise from his backpack, a simple lunch of sandwiches and apples. "Sarah and I used to picnic here," he said, spreading a worn blanket on a dry patch of ground. She called it the dreaming spot. Said, "You could see the whole world from here if you looked right." Elizabeth settled beside him, understanding what Sarah had meant. The view encompassed the entire farm, fields stretching toward distant hills, the old barn standing sentinel, the farmhouse nestled in its grove of trees. Everything that made this place special. "Tell me another Sarah story," she asked softly. Instead of making her jealous, these glimpses of his past love gave her hope. James knew how to cherish, how to build something real and lasting. He smiled, pulling out his wallet and extracting a faded photo. This was her first day teaching. She was so nervous, spent hours picking out the perfect outfit. In the picture, a young woman with laughing eyes stood in front of a classroom, her whole life ahead of her. "She was beautiful," Elizabeth said sincerely. "She was." James carefully returned the photo. "You know what she'd say about all this? About you showing up during a storm, helping save the farm, making everything," he gestured vaguely, "brighter somehow." Elizabeth held her breath, waiting. "She'd say it was meant to be." His voice was soft but certain. "She always believed everything happened for a reason, even the hard things." He turned to face her fully. Elizabeth, her name on his lips, held a world of questions, of possibilities. She met his gaze, seeing in his eyes everything she'd been longing for: acceptance, understanding, something deeper growing. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, James leaned forward. His hand came up to cup her cheek, calloused fingers infinitely gentle against her skin. When his lips met hers, Elizabeth felt something inside her shift and settle, like the last piece of a puzzle falling into place. The kiss was soft, questioning, full of tender discovery. She tasted coffee and sunshine and something uniquely James, and knew with sudden clarity that she was in trouble. Because this real, honest, profound connection was everything she'd been searching for without knowing it. They parted slowly, foreheads touching. James's thumb traced her cheekbone, and Elizabeth couldn't help leaning into his touch. For a moment, she let herself imagine a future here. Mornings like this stretching into years, building something true together, finding her place in the Cooper farm's ongoing story. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket, shattering the moment. Walsh's message flashed across her screen. Board meeting tomorrow. Your absence is no longer acceptable. Reality crashed back like a physical blow. Elizabeth pulled away, guilt twisting in her chest. James deserved the truth before this went any further, but looking at him, this good, honest man who'd opened his home and his heart to her, she couldn't bear to see the change in his eyes when he learned who she really was. "Hey," he said softly, noting her sudden tension. "We don't have to figure everything out right now." If only he knew how wrong he was. Everything would have to be figured out, and soon. Because Elizabeth Morgan couldn't hide forever, and when she emerged, she might lose this precious thing just taking root between them. But for now, she let him draw her close again, savoring the solid warmth of him. The sun wheeled overhead, the oak's shadows shifted, and Elizabeth held tight to this perfect moment, knowing all too well how quickly dreams could shatter in the light of day. The next morning, Elizabeth slipped out before dawn, needing to make a call where James couldn't overhear. Her father's antique pocket watch weighed heavy in her jacket. She'd taken to carrying it lately, a tangible reminder of the responsibilities she was avoiding. "Thomas," she said when Walsh answered, her voice shifting automatically into its CEO cadence. "You need to give me more time." "Elizabeth, be reasonable," Walsh sighed. "The board is in chaos. Shareholders are panicking. Your little adventure has cost the company millions in market value already." She watched the sun rise over James's fields, her worlds colliding with every word. "I'm not coming back yet. Handle things for a few more days." "I saw you at that farmer's market," Walsh said quietly. "You looked different. Happy maybe. But you can't just abandon everything your father built, everything he trusted you to protect." Elizabeth's fingers closed around the pocket watch. "I'm not abandoning anything. I just need time to play farmer with that man. Don't look surprised. Of course I had him investigated. James Cooper, widowed, facing foreclosure. Rather convenient timing, don't you think?" "Don't," Elizabeth's voice turned to ice. "Don't you dare imply that he might be interested in more than just you. Elizabeth, you're worth billions. Men have played longer games for less." She ended the call, hands shaking. Walsh was wrong about James. She knew that bone deep. But he wasn't wrong about her responsibilities, the legacy she was letting drift. When she returned to the house, she found James at his laptop, frowning at the screen. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Interesting article in the business news," he said carefully, "about Elizabeth Morgan, the missing CEO." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "There's a photo," he continued. "It's not very clear, but..." He turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a picture from her last charity gala, her hair elegantly styled, diamonds at her throat. Nothing like the woman who'd been mucking out stalls and hauling sandbags. "James," she started, but he held up a hand. "I've been looking at this photo for an hour," he said, "trying to convince myself I was seeing things, that the woman I'm falling for isn't..." He ran a hand through his hair. "Tell me I'm wrong." Elizabeth sank into a kitchen chair, all her carefully constructed walls crumbling. "You're not wrong." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Finally, James spoke. "Why?" "It started as an escape," she said softly. One night of running from responsibilities, from pressure, from a life that never quite fit. Then I met you, and it became—" she gestured helplessly. "Something else. Something real." "Real?" His laugh held no humor. "You've been lying to me since the moment we met." "No." Elizabeth leaned forward intently. "My name, my position, yes, I concealed those. But everything else, how I feel about this place, about the work, about you, that's all true." James stood, pacing the worn kitchen floor. "Do you know what these past 2 weeks have been like for me? Finding myself caring for someone, again starting to hope." He stopped, facing her. "I thought we were building something honest." "We were. We are." Elizabeth stood too, instinctively reaching for him before letting her hand fall. "James, please, being here with you, it's the first time in my life I've felt like myself. Not an heiress, not a CEO, just me." "And which you is real?" he asked quietly. "The corporate billionaire or the woman who stayed up all night helping save my barn?" "Both," she whispered. "Neither. I'm still figuring that out." She pulled out her father's pocket watch, holding it out to him. "This is the only thing of value I brought with me. Everything else, the designer clothes, the jewelry, the trappings of that life, I left behind, because I needed to know if I could be more than what my wealth makes me." James took the watch, studying its aged face. "And what have you learned?" "That real wealth isn't in bank accounts," Elizabeth said. "It's in soil that your great-grandfather tilled. It's in neighbors showing up during a storm. It's in the way you look at me when you think I don't notice." Her voice broke. "It's in everything I'm afraid of losing, now that you know the truth." He handed the watch back, his fingers brushing hers. "I need time," he said finally, "to process this." Elizabeth nodded, tears threatening. "I understand. But James, nothing about how I feel about you was ever a lie." He walked to the door, pausing without turning around. "The irony is, I believe you, and that somehow makes it harder." Then he was gone, screen door banging shut behind him. Elizabeth sank back into the chair, the watch ticking steadily in her palm. Outside she could hear the normal sounds of farm. Morning, roosters crowing, cattle lowing, the distant rumble of tractors, life continuing even as her carefully balanced worlds came crashing down around her. The final notice from the bank arrived that afternoon, its official letterhead stark and uncompromising. James stood at the kitchen counter, reading it for the 3rd time, while Elizabeth watched from the doorway, neither of them quite sure where. They stood with each other now. "They're calling the loan," he said finally, his voice hollow. 90 days to pay in full or begin foreclosure proceedings." His fingers traced the Cooper family Bible beside him, generations of history captured. In its pages, all those years of hard work, of building something that mattered, and it comes down to this piece of paper. Elizabeth's hands itched to reach for her phone, to make the calls that could solve this with a few signatures. Instead, she asked, "How much?" 800,000. James laughed without humor. "Might as well be 8 billion, for all the difference it makes." The exact amount in her personal checking account, Elizabeth thought with bitter irony, less than she'd spent on her last vacation. "I could—" she started. "Don't." His voice was sharp. "Don't offer what we both know you. Could easily give. That's not how I want to save this place. Even if it means losing everything." James turned to face her fully. "You of all people should understand about legacy, about wanting to succeed or fail on your own terms." The truth of his words hit her hard. Wasn't that exactly what she'd been trying to do here, to prove her worth beyond her wealth? Before she could respond, a car pulled up outside, the sleek black vehicle she'd been dreading. Walsh stepped out, impeccable in his designer suit, looking utterly out of place against the weathered farmhouse. "Elizabeth," he called, not bothering to wait for an invitation. "Enough games. The board meeting starts in 4 hours." She felt James stiffen beside her, saw his hands clench on the counter. The physical manifestation of her other life had arrived, shattering what remained of her carefully constructed sanctuary. "You must be Mr. Cooper. Walsh said smoothly. "I hope you've enjoyed having our CEO as your guest, but playtime's over. There's a company to run." "Thomas," Elizabeth warned, but James was already moving forward. "Get off my property," he said quietly, with the same tone he used to calm spooked horses. "Whatever game you think is being played here, you're wrong." Walsh smiled thinly. "A game? No, this is business. Elizabeth has responsibilities, people who depend on her. Surely you understand obligation, Mr. Cooper, or did you think you could just keep her here, playing farm wife until she solved all your financial difficulties?" Elizabeth saw the blow land, saw James flinch, as if physically struck. All his doubts about her deception, about her motives, reflected in Walsh's cruel implications. "That's enough!" Her voice cracked like a whip, pure CEO authority ringing through the kitchen. "Thomas, you're fired." Walsh blinked. "You can't." "I just did. The board can ratify it in 4 hours, or they can accept my resignation. Their choice." She pulled out her phone, fingers flying over the keys. "I'm calling an emergency shareholder meeting. We'll see how the stock prices react to you suggesting the company would be better off without the founder's daughter." She turned to James, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. "I'm sorry. I never meant for my worlds to collide like this. But I need you to know, everything that happened here was real, the most real thing in my life." The silence stretched, broken only by Walsh spluttering protests. Finally, James spoke. "You're different when you're being CEO. Harder. Colder." "Yes," she admitted. "It's a role I learned to play. Just like you learned to be strong for everyone. Else after Sarah died, we all have our masks. And which is the real you? I think..." She looked around the kitchen at the life she'd been living these past weeks. "I think I'm only now figuring that out." A new car was approaching. She recognized the sound of Martha's truck. Through the window she could see other vehicles following. The community coming to support James after hearing about the foreclosure. Notice, the crisis point had arrived. Elizabeth Morgan, CEO, was needed in the city, but Elizabeth, the woman who'd found herself in this kitchen, who'd fallen in love with a farmer and his legacy, she was needed here. Her phone buzzed with messages from the board, from shareholders, from the empire she'd been born to rule. The bank notice sat heavy on the counter, its deadline echoing the one she faced with her company. 2 worlds, 2 legacies, 2 versions of herself. And time had run out for trying to keep them separate. Martha was the first through the door, stopping short at the scene before her. James rigid with tension, Elizabeth facing off against a suit-clad stranger, and countless messages pinging on phones throughout the kitchen. The rest of the community filtered in behind her, their concerned expressions turning to confusion. "Elizabeth Morgan," Walsh announced to the room, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "CEO of Morgan Industries, net worth approximately $4 billion. So much for your simple farm worker fantasy." The collective gasp seemed to pull all the air from the room. Elizabeth watched faces she'd grown to care about transform with shock, betrayal, and, worst of all, understanding. Every shared coffee, every moment of connection, now being re-examined through the lens of her wealth. "Is it true?" Martha asked softly. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, drawing on a lifetime of board meetings and press conferences. "Yes, I'm Elizabeth Morgan, but that's not all I am." "Well," drawled Bill Henderson from the feed store, "this explains your fancy business ideas at the market." "Actually," James interrupted, surprising everyone, "those ideas came from understanding farming, from working beside us, from caring about this community." He met Elizabeth's eyes briefly before looking away. "The money doesn't change that part." Walsh scoffed. "How touching. But the board meeting starts in 3 hours, and the private jet is waiting. Time to return to reality, Elizabeth." "Reality." Elizabeth felt something snap inside her. You want to talk about reality, Thomas? Reality is 4 generations of family history in that Bible. Reality is neighbors showing up during a storm without being asked. Reality is... Her voice caught. Reality is finding out who you really are when all the trappings are stripped away. She turned to address the gathered community. I didn't plan this. I was running away when I found this place. From pressure, from expectations, from a life that felt like a performance. But what I found here, she gestured to the worn kitchen, the fields beyond, the faces watching her. This is more real than anything in my other life. Yet you lied to us, someone called out. To James. Yes. Elizabeth met James's gaze, squarely. I lied about my name, my position, my wealth, because I needed to know if I could be valued for myself, not my money. I needed to know if I could do honest work, make real connections, be worthy of a place like this. Martha stepped forward. And what about all your suggestions for the town? The restaurant partnership, the tourism plans? Was that just some rich person's game? No! Elizabeth's denial was fierce. Those ideas came from seeing what this community already has. History, authenticity, connection. Things my world constantly tries to manufacture but can never quite achieve. A tablet was thrust into her hands. One of the local teenagers had pulled up a business magazine cover featuring her in full corporate regalia. The contrast between that polished image and her current self, in borrowed clothes with mud on her boots, couldn't have been starker. Both pictures are me, Elizabeth said quietly. The CEO who can run a billion-dollar company and the woman who learned to feed chickens without flinching. I'm just finally figuring out how to be both at once. Walsh checked his watch pointedly. Fascinating identity crisis, but the shareholders will wait, Elizabeth cut him off. I'm not leaving until this is resolved. There's nothing to resolve, James said, his voice tired. You have your world to get back to. We have a farm to lose. The bank notice still sat on the counter between them, its deadline a ticking clock, for more than just the farm. Elizabeth looked at it, then at her phone displaying the board meeting agenda, then at James, this proud, honest man she'd grown to love. She'd come here running from her identity as Elizabeth Morgan, but maybe it was time to stop running and start building bridges instead. What if, she said slowly, there was a way to save the farm that didn't involve charity, a way to merge these two worlds without compromising either? James's expression was guarded, but she saw a flicker of something. Not quite hope, but willingness to listen. The community members pressed closer, while Walsh's face darkened with suspicion. Elizabeth took a deep breath. Everything hinged on what she said next. Her company's future, the farm's survival, and most importantly, her chance at keeping the love she'd found in this unexpected place. 3 days after Elizabeth's departure, James found himself staring at the morning paper spread across his kitchen table. Her face looked back at him from the business section. Morgan Industries CEO returns, announces major agricultural initiative. She wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than his monthly operating expenses, but her eyes held a familiar determination he'd seen when she faced down that aggressive chicken. The house felt emptier without her. He'd gotten used to mourning. Coffee shared in comfortable silence, to her endless questions about farming, to the way she'd hum unconsciously while doing dishes. Now there was just the quiet and a pile of media inquiries he'd been ignoring. His phone buzzed, another reporter wanting a statement about his relationship with the billionaire CEO, as if they could reduce everything that had happened to a clickbait headline. The screen door creaked, and Martha let herself in, bearing a casserole and yesterday's mail. Thought you might need feeding, she said, setting down her burden, since your personal chef ran off to Wall Street. Martha, he warned. She held up her hands in surrender. Sorry. Bad joke. She settled into Sarah's old chair. Funny how he'd stopped thinking of it that way when Elizabeth sat there. Have you watched her press conference? He shook his head. He hadn't been able to bring himself to see her back in that other life, playing that other role. "Maybe you should," Martha said gently. She talked about rural investment, agricultural sustainability, supporting family farms. She paused. Sounded an awful lot like someone who learned to care about these things firsthand. James traced the grain of the wooden table, worn smooth by generations of Cooper hands. "It doesn't matter. Our worlds are too different." "Are they?" Martha pushed the business section closer. "Read the article, James. Really read it." After she left, he finally did. The initiative Elizabeth announced wasn't just corporate philanthropy. It was a comprehensive plan for partnering with family farms, providing capital and modernization while preserving their independence and legacy. The kind of thing someone could only design if they understood both worlds. His email pinged. A formal proposal from Morgan Industries addressed to Mr. James Cooper, owner and operator of Cooper Family Farm. Professional, detailed, nothing personal, just business terms for a potential partnership. He thought about Elizabeth's notebook full of ideas, her genuine excitement about the farmers' market, her instinctive understanding of what made this community special. None of that had been fake, even if her name was. The phone rang. Bill Henderson this time. "Jimmy, you see this proposal? She sent one to every farm in the county. It's actually good, real good. Like she actually listened when she was here." She had listened. That was the thing about Elizabeth, both Elizabeths. She paid attention, saw possibilities, found ways to build things up instead of tearing them down. A text from Martha. "Channel 5 now. She's doing a live interview." James found himself reaching for the remote before he could think better of it. And there she was, poised and professional, but with something new in her bearing, a groundedness he recognized from their time together. "Yes, I spent time in farming communities," she was saying. "It changed my perspective on what real value looks like. These aren't just businesses we're talking about. They're legacies, histories, the backbone of our food system. They deserve partners who understand that, who want to preserve what makes them special while helping them thrive." The interviewer leaned forward. "And the rumors about a romantic connection to one of these farmers?" Elizabeth's composure flickered for just a moment. "My personal life isn't relevant to this initiative. What matters is building bridges between two worlds that need each other, even if they don't always realize it." James turned off the TV, his thoughts churning. On his counter sat the bank notice, its deadline looming. Beside it, Morgan Industries' proposal offered a lifeline that wouldn't require him to sacrifice his pride or his independence. She'd found a way to help that honored who he was, what this place meant. The question was whether he could accept it, whether he could bridge their worlds the way she was trying to do. His phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from an unknown number, but he knew instantly who it was. "The offer is genuine. No strings, no hidden agendas, just business. The rest, that's up to you." Outside his window, the morning sun lit up fields that had supported his family for generations. Fields that could still have a future if he was willing to accept that. Sometimes help could come from unexpected places, and love could bridge even the widest gaps. He just had to decide if he was brave enough to try. Elizabeth stared out her penthouse office window, the city sprawling beneath her like a glittering circuit board. A week ago, she'd been watching sunrise over James's fields. Now she was back in her other life, but nothing felt quite the same. "The agricultural initiative is gaining traction," her new assistant reported, sliding another document onto her already full desk. "Rural investment firms are calling, wanting to partner. The board is cautiously optimistic. And the Cooper farm proposal? No response yet." Elizabeth nodded, dismissing her assistant with a gesture that felt mechanical now. She'd crafted that proposal carefully, stripping it of any personal overtones, making it pure business. A chance for James to save his farm without compromising his principles. Her phone lit up with a text from Martha. "He misses you, you fool, but he's as stubborn as you are." Before she could respond, her office door opened. James stood there, looking both out of place and completely self-possessed. In his work clothes, a folder tucked under his arm. "Your security team," he said with a hint of amusement, "is very thorough. Had to prove I wasn't an industrial spy 3 different times." Elizabeth stood slowly, her heart thundering. "James," Ms. Morgan, but his eyes held warmth behind the formality. "I've come about your proposal." She gestured to a chair, trying to maintain professional composure. He sat, but not before taking in the office, the view, the expensive art, the trappings of power that had once been her whole world. "Quite a change from my kitchen table," he observed. "Different, not better." The words slipped out before she could stop them. He smiled slightly, opening his folder. "I've had some time to study your initiative. It's surprisingly good." "Surprisingly?" "Well, I wasn't sure if the woman who couldn't handle one aggressive chicken could manage a billion-dollar agricultural program." The tension broke as they both laughed, remembering. For a moment they were back in that barn, sharing a simple morning. "The thing is," James continued more seriously, "you really did learn while you were there, not just about farming, but about what matters. This program," he tapped the proposal, "it protects what's important. Family ownership, local control, traditional methods alongside modern innovations. That was the goal. And the Cooper farm? Was that just another test case?" Elizabeth met his eyes squarely. "You know it wasn't." He nodded slowly. "The thing about bridges," he said, "is they have to be built from both sides. You've started from yours. Maybe it's time I reached out from mine." He pulled out a paper from his folder, the lease agreement for new farming equipment, filled out in his careful handwriting. "I'm accepting the proposal. As a business partnership." He paused. "The rest, that's something we'd have to figure out together." "Together sounds good," Elizabeth said softly. "But," he held up a hand, "I have conditions." "Of course you do." She couldn't help smiling. This was the James she knew. Practical, thoughtful, unwilling to take the easy path if it wasn't the right one. "First, the farm stays in Cooper hands. No corporate ownership ever. Already guaranteed in the contract. Second, I want to be part of developing these programs for other farms. Not just implementing them, helping design them. There's knowledge that only comes from working the land." Elizabeth felt her smile widening. "Done. In fact, I was hoping you'd say that." "And third," he stood, moving to the window beside her, "the CEO of Morgan Industries needs to get her hands dirty occasionally. Remember where the real work happens." She turned to face him fully. "Are you offering me a job?" "Mr. Cooper, more like a partnership in all ways." The word hung between them, full of possibility. Elizabeth looked at their reflections in the window, the corporate CEO and the farmer standing together against the backdrop of the city. "Partners," she said. "I like that." His hand found hers, calloused fingers intertwining with manicured buttons, different textures, different worlds, but fitting together all the same. "Although," he added with a glint in his eye, "you still need to work on your chicken handling skills." Elizabeth laughed, the sound carrying through her elegant office. "Well, good thing I have an excellent teacher." The community hall was packed tighter than it had been during the storm crisis, but this time with an air of excitement rather than fear. Elizabeth stood at the podium, James beside her, facing their neighbors with a detailed proposal for a local farming cooperative. "The concept is simple," Elizabeth explained. Her corporate polish softened by the genuine enthusiasm she'd developed during her time on the farm. "We combine traditional farming wisdom with modern business practices. Each farm maintains its independence while sharing resources and market access. And Morgan Industries' role in this," called out Bill Henderson, though his tone held more curiosity than suspicion now. James stepped forward. "They're partners, not owners, providing capital and connections while we provide the expertise and labor. Elizabeth and I have worked out a structure that protects everyone's interests." Martha raised her hand. "And you too. How does that partnership work?" Elizabeth felt warmth rise in her cheeks as James's hand found the small of her back. "They're relationship had become something of a local legend, the billionaire CEO and the farmer who'd fallen in love during a storm. "We're figuring it out day by day," she answered honestly. "Just like this cooperative. It's about finding the best of both worlds." The meeting continued, with farmers asking detailed questions about financing, equipment sharing, and market strategies. Elizabeth watched James field the technical farming queries while she handled the business aspects, their knowledge complementing each other perfectly. "Here's what I'm thinking," said Carol Henderson, standing up. "My restaurant could commit to buying a guaranteed percentage of local produce, but I'd need consistent supply, coordinated between multiple farms." "Exactly the kind of synergy we're looking for," Elizabeth nodded. "And with the cooperative's processing facility," several voices asked at once. James grinned. "Maybe we should show them, honey." Elizabeth clicked to the next slide, revealing architectural plans for converting an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The drawings showed modern processing equipment alongside storage areas and a farmer's market space. "The cooperative would own it collectively," she explained, "allowing us to process and store crops, extend the selling season, and create value-added products." A buzz of excitement filled the room as farmers began to see the possibilities. Elizabeth caught Martha's knowing smile. The older woman had been their sounding board as they developed these plans, helping them understand what the community would accept and what they'd resist. "But what about the organic certification? Some of us have?" asked a younger farmer. "And those of us who want to stay conventional? The facility is designed with separate processing lines," James explained. "We protect everyone's methods while sharing the costs of equipment and distribution." The questions continued for hours, each answer revealing how carefully they'd thought through this merger of traditional farming and modern business. When the meeting finally ended, people lingered, forming excited discussion groups around the hall. "Well," Martha said, approaching them, "you two really did it. Found a way to make both worlds work together." Elizabeth leaned against James, comfortable now in both her designer suit and the practical boots she'd kept from her time on the farm. "We had good teachers. This community showed me what real value looks like. And she showed us that progress doesn't have to mean losing our identity," James added, his arm warm around her waist. Through the hall's windows, they could see the sun setting over fields that had supported families for generations. Fields that would now continue that legacy, adapting without surrendering their essential character. "Though I still say," James whispered in her ear, "that you're better at corporate negotiations than chicken wrangling." Elizabeth laughed, the sound carrying through the hall. "Good thing I have you to handle the poultry division of our partnership." Around them, the future they'd envisioned was already taking shape in the enthusiastic conversations of their neighbors. A future that bridged city and country, tradition and innovation, heart and business. "You know," Martha mused, watching, "the crowd, when you first showed up in that barn during the storm, I don't think anyone could have predicted this outcome." Elizabeth smiled, remembering the rain-soaked night that had changed everything. "Sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected storms." James squeezed her hand, and she saw in his eyes the same certainty she felt. They'd found their balance, their way to be true to themselves while building something larger together. It wasn't always easy straddling two worlds, but it was perfectly, completely right. The bank manager shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he reviewed the documents spread across his desk. On one side sat the original foreclosure notice for the Cooper farm. On the other, a comprehensive business plan backed by one of the largest corporations in the country. "Well," he said, looking between James and Elizabeth, "this is certainly unexpected, but viable," Elizabeth noted. Every inch the CEO, despite her casual attire. She'd chosen to wear jeans and a simple blazer to this meeting, bridging her two worlds. James added, "The cooperative already has commitments from 12 local farms. The processing facility starts construction next month." The manager picked up the proposal again, though he'd already read it 3 times. And Morgan Industries is prepared to guarantee the loan restructuring? As a business investment, not a personal one, Elizabeth clarified, knowing how important this distinction was to James. The Cooper farm remains independently owned and operated. We're simply providing the financial framework for expansion. James reached for her hand under the table, squeezing gently. They'd spent weeks perfecting this arrangement, finding ways to save the farm that preserved its integrity while acknowledging modern business realities. The renovation plans for the farmhouse are particularly interesting, the manager commented, turning to that section. An educational center for sustainable farming practices, James explained, teaching the next generation while honoring traditional methods. Sarah, his voice caught slightly, but he continued, Sarah always wanted to connect kids with where their food comes from. Elizabeth watched him speak, love and pride mingling in her chest. He'd come so far from the man who'd initially rejected any outside help, finding ways to grow while staying true to himself. The manager closed the folder decisively. Well, I think we can work with this. The terms are solid. The business plan is sound. And frankly, the publicity of partnering with both Morgan Industries and a historic local farm doesn't hurt. As they left the bank, James pulled Elizabeth to a stop on the sidewalk. We did it, he said softly. Actually did it. Did? You doubt we would? Honestly? Yes, kept waiting for it all to fall apart. The farm, us, this crazy idea of merging our worlds. Elizabeth stood on tiptoe to kiss him, not caring who saw. Not crazy. Just right. They drove back to the farm. Both of them still called it that, though it was rapidly becoming much more. Construction equipment stood ready to begin work on the new educational center, while the old barn was being carefully reinforced, preserving its character while updating its functionality. Inside the house, Martha had left lunch, waiting. She'd taken to caring for them both, claiming they'd forget to eat otherwise, too caught up in their plans and projects. The contractor called, James said as they ate. Wanted to know if we're sure about keeping the old kitchen cabinets, said new ones would be more efficient. And you said that some things are worth preserving. He glanced around the kitchen, where they'd first shared coffee, where she'd learned to cook on his mother's stove, where they'd fallen in love over simple meals and honest conversations. Some things carry memories that matter more than efficiency. Elizabeth nodded, understanding completely. Their renovation plans carefully balanced modernization with preservation, just as their relationship balanced their different worlds. Her phone buzzed, a message from Walsh, who'd surprisingly chosen to stay on as a consultant after she'd rescinded his firing. He'd admitted her agricultural initiative was showing better returns than expected, though he still claimed she was crazy for splitting her time between the city and the farm. Board meeting tomorrow, she sighed. Quarterly reviews. Want company? She looked at him in surprise. You hate board meetings. I hate seeing you face them alone more, James shrugged. Besides, the cooperative presentation is on the agenda. Who better to explain it than a real farmer? Elizabeth felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. This was what real partnership looked like, supporting each other's worlds, sharing burdens, finding ways to make it all work. The renovation plan sat on the counter, next to the old family Bible and her father's pocket watch. Old and new, past and future, all coming together in ways she'd never imagined that stormy night when she'd first sought shelter in his barn. You know, she said thoughtfully, I never did thank that aggressive chicken. If she hadn't terrified me that first morning, I might not have stayed long enough to fall in love. James laughed, pulling her close. Remind me to give her extra feed, though I'm pretty sure she still thinks she runs this place. She can think what she likes. We know better. Through the window, they could see the future taking shape, construction markers for the new buildings, fields ready for the next season, the old barn standing proud among the changes. Their future, built on respect for the past and hope for what was to come. A life neither of them had expected, but now couldn't imagine living without. Moving day came on a bright autumn morning, exactly 1 year after the storm that had first brought Elizabeth to the farm. She stood in her penthouse apartment, surrounded by boxes labelled with her new address, Cooper Farm. "The media will have a field day with this," Walsh commented, watching movers carefully pack her few chosen belongings. "Billionaire CEO trades Manhattan for manure." "Write whatever headlines you want," Elizabeth replied, fingers brushing the familiar texture of her father's pocket watch. "Just make sure they mention the cooperative's success. That's the story that matters." The past year had proven their critics wrong. The agricultural initiative had exceeded projections, the cooperative was thriving, and Elizabeth had successfully balanced her roles as CEO and farmer's wife, though she'd never quite mastered the art of chicken wrangling. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Educational Centre passed final inspection. Sarah would have loved it. Elizabeth smiled, remembering the first class of local children who'd visited last week, their eyes wide as James taught them about soil composition and crop rotation. Sarah's dream of connecting young people to farming was becoming reality in ways that honoured her memory while building something new. "You're sure about this?" Walsh asked, more gently than his usual tone. "Living full-time on a farm, commuting to the city when needed?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything." Elizabeth picked up the last photo from her desk. Her father in his prime, standing proud in front of Morgan Industries headquarters. "Dad always said true wealth isn't about money. It's about building something that matters." She'd kept her office in the city, of course. Morgan Industries still needed its CEO, and she'd learned to balance both worlds rather than choosing between them. But home, real home, was a weathered farmhouse with creaky floors and history in its walls. The drive to the farm felt different this time, knowing she wasn't going back to the city. As she turned onto the familiar dirt road, she saw the changes they'd made together. The new educational centre rising behind the original farmhouse, the modernised barn still wearing its century-old weather vane, the processing facility humming with activity in the distance. James waited on the porch, looking exactly as he had that first night, steady, genuine, real. But now there was a wedding ring on his finger, matching the simple band she wore alongside her father's watch. "Welcome home," he said as she climbed. The familiar steps. For good this time. Inside, Martha had organized a small welcome dinner with their closest neighbors. The kitchen was filled with the scent of her famous pot roast and the sound of friendly chatter. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Bill Henderson commented, helping himself to more potatoes. "Since our CEO here showed up pretending to be a farmhand." "Not pretending," James corrected, his arm warm around Elizabeth's waist. "Learning. We all were." Elizabeth looked around the kitchen, her kitchen now permanently. Sarah's cookbooks still lined the shelves, but they'd been joined by modern volumes on sustainable farming. The old family Bible sat in its place of honor, new pages added to record their marriage and the cooperative's founding. Her phone buzzed again, a message from her assistant about tomorrow's video conference. Technology meant she could handle most CEO duties from the farm office they'd built in the converted sunroom, though she still went to the city for major meetings. "Feeling overwhelmed?" James asked softly, noticing her expression. The opposite. Elizabeth leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of sunshine and hard work that always clung to his clothes. "Feeling like everything is exactly where it should be." Through the window she could see the sunset painting the fields gold, just as it had that first evening when she'd been a stranger seeking shelter. Now those fields were her home, their future, the foundation of something larger than either of them had imagined. "Although," she added with a smile, "that red chicken still hates me." James laughed, the sound mixing with the warm conversations around them. "Some things never change, but the important ones." He squeezed her hand. "Those changed for the better." Elizabeth looked at their gathered neighbors, no, their family now, and felt the last piece of her heart settle into place. She was Elizabeth Morgan Cooper, CEO and farmer's wife, equally at home in boardrooms and barns. It wasn't always easy, this bridge they'd built between worlds, but it was perfectly, completely theirs. 1 year to the day after Elizabeth's official move to the farm, the community gathered to celebrate the cooperative's first harvest festival. Tables stretched across the farmhouse lawn, laden with food made from their collective produce. Children darted between educational displays while their parents chatted with visiting investors and agricultural students. Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching James demonstrate traditional farming techniques to an enthusiastic group. He'd become the face of their educational program, his natural teaching ability drawing people from across the country to learn about sustainable farming practices. "Quite a change from last year," Martha said, joining her with 2 glasses of lemonade, "when you were hiding in my shop from that board member." Elizabeth laughed, accepting the drink. "I think I like this better. No more hiding. The evidence of their merged lives was everywhere. Corporate executives mingled with local farmers, discussing crop yields and market strategies with equal enthusiasm. The old barn housed a state-of-the-art computer system for tracking cooperative inventory, while the new processing facility preserved traditional methods alongside modern efficiency. "Mrs. Morgan Cooper," a young girl ran up, clutching a hand-drawn picture. "Mr. James showed us how to make dirt, real dirt." Elizabeth knelt to examine the drawing of the composting process. "That's wonderful. And you know what? You can just call me Elizabeth." As the girl ran off to show her parents, Elizabeth caught James watching her with that soft smile that still made her heart skip. They'd found their rhythm this past year, her splitting time between CEO duties and farm work, him balancing traditional farming with modern business practices, different worlds woven together into something stronger than either alone. The afternoon sun turned golden as everyone gathered for the ceremony. James stood beside Elizabeth at the podium. They'd set up on the lawn, his hand warm in hers as she addressed the crowd. "A year ago, many people thought this idea was impossible," she began. "A corporate CEO and a traditional farmer trying to bridge 2 different worlds. But looking around today, I see something extraordinary. Not 2 worlds colliding, but one community growing stronger together." James stepped forward. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations, he added. "Each generation faced its own challenges, found its own ways to adapt while holding on to what matters. Sarah." He paused, squeezing Elizabeth's hand. "Sarah used to say that the best kind of growth doesn't erase what came before, it builds on it, makes it stronger." Together, they unveiled the hand-carved sign that would mark the entrance to the educational center, Cooper Farm Learning Center, where tradition meets tomorrow. Below it, Sarah's favorite quote, "The richest soil grows from old roots and new seeds." As evening settled over the farm, lanterns were lit and music began to play. Elizabeth found herself swaying with James on the makeshift dance floor, surrounded by their unique extended family, farmers and executives, locals and visitors, all brought together by a storm that had forced 2 worlds to meet. "Happy," James murmured in her ear. Elizabeth looked around at the life they'd built, the thriving farm, the successful cooperative, the future they were creating together. "More than I ever imagined possible. Even with that chicken still terrorizing you?" "Even then," she laughed, resting her head on his shoulder, "although I still say she's plotting something." Above them, stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in a storm-battered barn. But now they shone over a place transformed, not by erasing what had been, but by carefully, lovingly building something new. Success, Elizabeth had learned, wasn't measured in dollar signs or